The gunshot that shattered Catherine Torres's kitchen window didn't come from rustlers or bandits, but from her own stampeding cattle crashing through the fence line that separated her land from the neighboring ranch. And the cowboy who'd been trying to turn them back had fired into the air in a last desperate attempt to redirect the herd. She stood on her porch in the scorching New Mexico heat of July 1882, watching 200 head of her best cattle thunder across what should have been a clear property boundary, mixing with the stock on the western side. The man on horseback who'd fired the warning shot pulled his hat low and rode toward her, and even through the dust cloud, she could see the frustration written across his sun-weathered face. Catherine was 24 years old and had inherited the eastern half of the former Double T Ranch 6 months earlier when her father died from pneumonia. The western half had gone to the foreman who'd worked the land for 30 years, but that man had passed just 2 months after her father, leaving the property to his nephew from Texas. She'd never met this nephew, had only received a terse letter informing her that Harrison Nash was taking possession of the western tract and would appreciate her keeping her stock on her own land. Now here he was, this Harrison Nash, riding up to her porch like he owned the place. Well, he owned half of it anyway. Catherine wiped flour from her hands onto her apron and stepped down into the yard, her boots kicking up small clouds of red dust. The heat was oppressive, the kind that made even breathing feel like work, and she could see sweat staining the back of Harrison's shirt as he dismounted. "Miss Torres." His voice was deeper than she'd expected, rough around the edges like a man who didn't waste words. He was tall, probably 30 or 31, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water after a storm. "We've got a problem. I can see that." Catherine shaded her eyes and looked past him to where the cattle were still running, mixing and mingling until it would take days to separate them properly. That fence was solid yesterday, not solid enough. Harrison pulled off his gloves and tucked them into his belt. "I found 3 posts rotted clear through at the base. Looks like they've been there since before either of us owned this land. When your herd got spooked, they went right through like it was made of paper." Catherine felt her jaw tighten. She'd checked that fence line herself just last week, or thought she had. Maybe she'd missed that section. Running a ranch alone, even with 3 hired hands, meant something always slipped through the cracks. What spooked them? Rattlesnake, best I could tell. "Big one, coiled up near the water trough on your side." Harrison's expression softened slightly. "Look, I'm not here to place blame. I'm here because we need to fix this before it gets worse. That boundary line's been disputed for 20 years according to the county records. My uncle and your father never could agree on where it should run. Now we've got mixed herds and no clear fence, and if we don't sort this out, we'll be fighting this same fight every month." She studied him carefully. Most men would have come over angry, demanding compensation or throwing accusations. Harrison Nash looked tired and practical, like someone who'd rather solve problems than create them. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we survey the line properly, legal and official, and split the cost. Then we build a fence that'll actually hold and maintain it together. Your land touches mine for 3 miles. That's a lot of fence to keep up, and it benefits us both if it stays standing." It made sense. Catherine hated that it made sense, because she'd been prepared to dislike this man on principle. He'd inherited land that should have stayed unified, land her father had poured his life into. But Harrison Nash wasn't responsible for the choices of dead men, and neither was she. "Fine. But we do this right. I want a surveyor from Santa Fe, not some local who'll favor one of us over the other." "Agreed." Harrison extended his hand, and after a moment Catherine shook it, His palm was calloused and warm, his grip firm but not crushing. In the meantime, we should separate the herds before they get too comfortable together. I've got 4 men who can help. If we start now, we might be done by nightfall. Catherine nodded and called for her hands, and soon 7 people were working in the burning afternoon sun to cut out cattle and drive them back to their respective sides of the invisible property line. Harrison worked as hard as any of his men, harder even, and Catherine found herself noticing the easy way he sat his horse, the calm authority in his voice when he gave directions. He wasn't showy about it, didn't need to prove anything. He just did the work. By the time the sun started sinking toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in the distance, they'd managed to separate most of the herd. Catherine's shoulders ached and her throat was parched despite the water she'd been drinking. Harrison rode over to where she sat on her mare, both of them watching the last few stragglers get pushed back east. "You've got good stock," he said, and it didn't sound like flattery, just observation. "Your father knew cattle." "He did." Catherine's voice came out rougher than intended. 6 months wasn't long enough to stop missing him. Taught me everything he knew, it shows. Harrison looked at her directly, and she was surprised by the respect she saw there. "I know this situation isn't what either of us would have chosen. Split ranch, unclear boundaries, all of it. But I think we can make it work if we're both willing to be reasonable." "Reasonable is fine," Catherine said. "Just don't expect me to be a pushover because I'm a woman." Something that might have been amusement flickered across Harrison's face. "Miss Torres, I just watched you rope and throw a 1,200-pound steer without asking for help. I don't think anyone could mistake you for a pushover." Despite herself, Catherine felt a smile tug at her lips. "Good. Then we understand each other." "I'll send word to Santa Fe tomorrow about the surveyor," Harrison said. "Might take a few weeks for someone to come out. Until then, we should probably keep an eye on that gap in the fence. I can have my men start clearing out those rotted posts tomorrow if you want. I'll have mine help. Like you said, it benefits us both." They parted as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that turned the red earth almost beautiful. Catherine rode back to her ranch house, a modest adobe structure her grandfather had built 40 years earlier, and tried not to think about how competent Harrison Nash had looked cutting cattle. She had too much work to do and too many worries to waste time noticing whether a man sat his horse well or had good hands with a rope. But that night, lying in bed with the window open to catch any hint of a breeze, she found herself thinking about his offer anyway. Partnership made sense. The ranch had been divided by inheritance law and old debts, but the land itself didn't care about human boundaries. Cattle wandered, water flowed where it wanted, and fence lines needed maintaining whether one person did it or two. Her father would have approved of the practical approach, even if he'd spent 20 years arguing with Harrison's uncle about property lines. The next morning, Catherine rode out early to inspect the damaged fence section herself. Someone had already been there. The rotted posts had been pulled and stacked neatly to one side, and fresh holes had been started for replacements. Harrison was there with 2 of his men, shirtless in the climbing heat, driving a new post into the hard ground with a heavy mallet. Catherine reined in her horse and watched for a moment before announcing herself. He looked up at the sound of hooves, sweat running down his chest and arms. Catherine kept her eyes firmly on his face. "You started without me. Sun's already hot. Figured we'd get a jump on it." Harrison set down the mallet and reached for his shirt, which was draped over a nearby fence post. "Your men coming. They'll be here within the hour. We had a mare foaling last night, so they were up late." Catherine dismounted and walked over to examine the work. The holes were straight and deep, properly dug. "This is good work. My uncle taught me that a fence is only as strong as its posts. Cut corners there and you'll be rebuilding every year. Harrison pulled on his shirt but didn't bother buttoning it. I sent that telegram to Santa Fe yesterday. Got a reply this morning. Surveyor named James Crawford says he can be here in 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Catherine frowned. That's a long time to maintain a temporary fence. It's that or wait until autumn. Crawford's the best and he's booked solid, but he says 3 weeks guaranteed. Harrison picked up a canteen and drank deeply before offering it to her. We can make do until then. I'll have men ride the line twice a day to check for breaches. Catherine accepted the canteen, trying not to think about the fact that his mouth had just been on it. The water was warm but welcome. I'll match that. Morning and evening checks. They worked together that morning, and when Catherine's 3 hands arrived, they made quick progress. By noon, they had a serviceable temporary fence erected, not pretty but functional. Harrison insisted on testing it himself, riding his horse along the length and checking each connection point. Only when he was satisfied did he call it done. I appreciate the help, Catherine said as they prepared to head back to their respective headquarters, and the fair approach to all this. No point in making enemies of neighbors, Harrison replied. We're going to be living next to each other for a long time, might as well make it pleasant. Over the next 3 weeks, Catherine saw more of Harrison Nash than she'd anticipated. He rode the fence line every morning just after dawn, and she rode it every evening before sunset, and somehow they always seemed to encounter each other near the midpoint. The first few times felt like coincidence. After that, Catherine suspected they were both timing their rides deliberately. They'd stop and talk, at first about ranch business and fence conditions and the upcoming survey. But gradually, their conversations widened to include other things. Harrison told her about growing up in Texas, about learning to cowboy on his uncle's ranch there before the old man came to New Mexico and married into money. Catherine talked about her father, about being raised to run a ranch because there were no sons to inherit. Did you ever resent it? Harrison asked one evening, both of them sitting on their horses while the sun painted long shadows across the grassland. Not having a choice. No, Catherine surprised herself with the certainty of it. I love this land, love the work even when it's hard, maybe especially when it's hard. My father never made me feel like I was second best because I wasn't a boy. He just taught me everything and trusted me to do it right. He must have been a good man. He was. Catherine looked out across the eastern half of the ranch, the land that was hers now. What about you? Did you want to come here or did you feel obligated? Harrison was quiet for a moment. Little of both. My uncle wrote to me 5 years ago saying he'd gotten sick and needed help. I came because family's family, you know, but I stayed because I fell in love with this country. Texas is beautiful, but there's something about New Mexico. The light's different here. The sky's bigger. It gets into your blood. Catherine knew exactly what he meant. She'd traveled to Denver once with her father to sell cattle, and the whole time she'd felt claustrophobic, hemmed in by buildings and people and noise. Wide, open country wasn't for everyone, but for those who understood it, nowhere else would ever feel quite like home. The surveyor arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks to the day from when Harrison had sent the telegram. James Crawford was a precise, serious man in his 50s who brought 2 assistants and an impressive array of equipment. He listened to both Catherine and Harrison explain the situation, reviewed the old property documents, and spent the next 4 days walking every inch of the disputed boundary with his instruments. Catherine tried to focus on her regular work, but found herself distracted, wondering what the survey would reveal. If the line moved significantly east, she'd lose prime grazing land. If it moved west, She'd gain some but potentially damage the growing understanding between her and Harrison. She was surprised to realize she didn't want that, didn't want to go back to being strangers with a fence between them. On Saturday evening, Crawford knocked on her door and asked if she could meet him and Harrison at the old boundary marker, a large cottonwood tree that marked roughly the midpoint of the property line. Catherine rode out as the sun was setting, her stomach tight with nerves she didn't quite understand. Harrison was already there, standing next to his horse and talking with Crawford. He looked up when Catherine approached, and she couldn't read his expression. Crawford cleared his throat. "I've completed my survey," the man said formally. "And I have to tell you both, this is one of the messier property situations I've encountered. The original survey from 1860 was poorly done, several markers have disappeared over the years, and the deed descriptions don't quite match the physical geography." Catherine's heart sank. This was going to be a legal nightmare, but Crawford held up a hand. "However, I've done my best to establish a fair and legally defensible boundary line. I've placed new markers along the entire 3-mile length. The line runs roughly where you've been maintaining your temporary fence, with some deviations. Miss Torres, you'll lose about 40 acres on the northern end but gain about 30 acres on the southern end. Mr. Nash, the reverse applies to you. Overall, the acreage comes out nearly equal to what you both thought you owned." Catherine let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "So we're not disputing the line. Not unless you want to tie this up in court for years and spend more on lawyers than the land is worth," Crawford said dryly. "My professional opinion is that this is as fair a division as can be made given the historical confusion. I'll file my survey with the county, and if neither of you contests it within 60 days, it becomes the official boundary." Harrison extended his hand to Crawford. "Thank you for the thorough work. Send me your bill." "Send half to each of us," Catherine corrected. "We agreed to split the cost." After Crawford left, Catherine and Harrison stood together under the cottonwood tree as darkness gathered. Crickets sang in the grass, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called out to the rising moon. "So that's settled," Harrison said quietly. "We have an official property line." "We do." Catherine felt oddly deflated. With the boundary established, there was less reason for them to meet, less excuse for those sunset conversations at the fence line. "I guess we can build a permanent fence now." "About that." Harrison turned to face her directly. "I have a different proposal." Catherine's pulse jumped. "What kind of proposal?" "The kind that might sound crazy." Harrison took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign he was working through something difficult. "These past 3 weeks, working with you, getting to know you, it's made me realize something. This division doesn't make sense. Not the land division, I mean. That's settled. I'm talking about us running 2 separate operations right next to each other, duplicating effort and expense." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we merge the operations. Run it as one ranch again, the way it was meant to be. We'd both maintain ownership of our halves, but we'd work it together. Combined resources, shared costs, unified management." Harrison's eyes met hers in the twilight. "I'm suggesting a partnership, Catherine." The use of her first name sent a shiver through her despite the lingering heat. "That's a big step. We barely know each other. I know you're smart and capable and you love this land as much as I do. I know you work harder than most men I've met and you don't quit when things get difficult. I know you're fair-minded and reasonable, and I know we work well together." Harrison stepped closer. "And I know that for the past 3 weeks I've been finding excuses to ride that fence line at the exact time when I might run into you." Catherine's breath caught. "I thought that was just me." "No." A smile ghosted across Harrison's face, visible even in the growing darkness. "Not just you." A partnership would be complicated, Catherine said, but her heart was beating faster. We'd need legal agreements, clear divisions of responsibility. We would, Harrison agreed, and we should do it right with lawyers and contracts and everything official. But Catherine, I think this could work. I think we could make this ranch something special, bigger and better than either of us could do alone. It was tempting, dangerously so. Catherine had been running her half alone for 6 months, and while she was managing, it was exhausting. Having a true partner, someone who shared both the work and the vision, would change everything. But partnerships were built on trust, and trust took time. "Let me think about it," she said finally. "This is my father's legacy. I can't make that decision lightly." "I understand." Harrison put his hat back on. "Take whatever time you need. The offer stands." They rode back toward their respective ranch houses, but as they reached the point where their paths diverged, Catherine called out to stop him. "Harrison," he turned in his saddle. "Yes." "Would you like to come to dinner tomorrow night? Nothing fancy, just a meal and a chance to talk more about what this partnership might look like." Even in the darkness, she could see his smile. "I'd like that very much." Catherine spent the next day in a state she refused to acknowledge as nervous excitement. She told herself she was simply being practical, using the dinner to discuss business arrangements. But she also found herself changing her dress 3 times and putting extra effort into the meal, roasting a chicken with vegetables from her garden, and baking the apple pie her father had always loved. Harrison arrived exactly on time, wearing clean clothes and carrying a bottle of wine. "My uncle's private stock," he explained. Seemed like an occasion. They ate at her small kitchen table, and the conversation flowed easily. Harrison laid out his vision for the combined ranch, talking about improved breeding programs and better water management, and the possibility of buying additional grazing rights on federal land. Catherine challenged him on specifics, asking hard questions about finances and decision-making authority, and he answered thoughtfully, never dismissing her concerns. "I'm not looking to take over your half," Harrison said as they finished the pie. "I'm looking for an equal partner. That means equal say in major decisions. If we can't agree on something, we'll bring in a third party to mediate, or we'll table it until we can find compromise. And the profits, split according to ownership percentages. We'd need to have the properties formally assessed to establish exact values, but my guess is they're close enough to call it 50-50. Harrison leaned back in his chair. "I know this is complicated because we're also clearly attracted to each other." Catherine nearly dropped her fork. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to. I saw you watching me dig fence posts, and I know you noticed me timing my fence rides to meet you." Harrison's expression was serious despite the lightness of his words. "I'm not saying we have to do anything about that. We can keep this strictly business if that's what you want, but I believe in being honest about what's happening." Catherine set down her fork carefully. "And what is happening, in your opinion?" "I think we're 2 people who respect each other, work well together, and happen to find each other attractive. I think that could either complicate a business partnership or enhance it, depending on how we handle it." Harrison met her eyes. "I'd like the chance to see where it goes, Catherine. Both the business partnership and the personal possibility, but only if you want the same thing." Her practical side said this was too fast, too risky. Her heart said something else entirely. "I want to see the books first, your financial records for the past year, and I'll show you mine. If we're really going to be partners, I need to know exactly what I'm partnering with." "Fair enough. I'll bring them over tomorrow." They spent the next week doing due diligence, reviewing each other's accounts and operations with meticulous care. Harrison's western half was slightly more profitable than her eastern half, mostly because he'd invested in a better irrigation system for his hay fields. But Catherine's breeding program was superior, and her cattle commanded better prices. The fit was complementary rather than competitive. The lawyers took another 2 weeks to draw up the partnership agreement. During that time, Catherine and Harrison continued their fence line meetings, but now they were franker with each other, sharing not just ranch business but personal stories and slowly built intimacy. Harrison told her about losing his parents in a wagon accident when he was 12, about being raised by various relatives who'd done their duty but never quite felt like home. Catherine talked about her mother's death from cholera when she was 8, about being raised by a father who'd loved her fiercely but never quite known what to do with a daughter. "We're both orphans," Harrison observed one evening. They were sitting on a blanket near the cottonwood tree, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Maybe that's why we understand each other. We both know what it's like to make your own way." "Maybe." Catherine was acutely aware of his shoulder nearly touching hers. They'd been careful not to cross certain lines, but the tension between them was growing stronger. Or maybe we're just two people who happen to inherit neighboring ranches. "You don't really believe that?" "No," she admitted. "I don't." Harrison turned to look at her, and in the starlight his face was all plains and shadows. "Catherine, I need you to know something. When I proposed this partnership, it was genuine. I want to work with you because I think we'll be successful together. But I'd be lying if I said that was the only reason." "What's the other reason?" "I'm falling in love with you." The words were quiet but certain. "I know it's fast. I know we should probably wait until the partnership is more established before complicating things. But I don't believe in dishonesty, and I don't want to pretend I'm not feeling what I'm feeling." Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. "Harrison, you don't have to say anything back. I'm not asking for promises or commitments. I just wanted you to know where I stand." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. "Whatever happens between us personally, I'll honor our business partnership. You have my word on that." Catherine looked down at their joined hands, his large and calloused, hers smaller but equally work-worn. "I'm falling for you too," she said quietly. "It scares me because I've never felt like this before, and because mixing business with personal feelings seems like asking for trouble. But I can't pretend it's not happening." Harrison lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so gentle it made her throat tight. "Then we'll figure it out together. No rushing, no pressure. We'll let it develop at its own pace." The partnership papers were signed on a hot August morning in the lawyer's office in Glenrio. Catherine and Harrison sat side by side as the lawyer explained various clauses and contingencies, and then they both signed their names, and it was official. The Double T Ranch was unified again, even if technically split between two owners. They celebrated that night with their combined ranch hands, 7 men who would now work for both of them. Harrison gave a short speech about new beginnings and shared goals, and Catherine added her own words about respect and hard work. The men seemed satisfied, and if they noticed the way their two employers kept glancing at each other, they were polite enough not to comment. After the others had drifted off to sleep in the bunkhouse, Catherine and Harrison stood together in the yard between the two ranch houses, neither quite ready to part ways. "We should probably establish which house becomes the main headquarters," Harrison said. "Yours is smaller but better located. Mine's newer but further from the best grazing." "We could use both," Catherine suggested. "Keep the operations separate but coordinated. You're already set up in the western house and I'm established in the east." "For now," Harrison agreed. "But eventually it would make more sense to consolidate." Eventually. The word hung between them, full of implications. Eventually suggested a future where they weren't just business partners. Eventually meant something Catherine was only beginning to let herself imagine. Harrison seemed to read her thoughts. I'm a patient man, Catherine. I can wait for eventually. What if eventually takes a long time? Then it takes a long time. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. You're worth waiting for. Catherine turned her face into his palm, letting herself lean into the touch. I'm not very good at the things women are supposed to be good at. I can't sew worth a damn. I burn as much bread as I bake successfully, and I'm more comfortable in the saddle than I am at a dance. I don't care about any of that. Harrison's thumb brushed across her cheekbone. I care that you can sit a horse all day in the heat without complaining. I care that you're the first one up and the last one to sleep. I care that you're brilliant with cattle and brave enough to run a ranch alone when most women would have sold out. That's what I see when I look at you. Harrison. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Yes, kiss me. He did, slow and careful, his lips warm against hers. Catherine's hands came up to grip his shirt, and she felt his arms wrap around her waist, pulling her closer. The kiss deepened, and Catherine felt something inside her unlock, some tightly held fear releasing its grip. This was right. This man, this moment, this future they were building together. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Harrison rested his forehead against hers. I should probably go before I do something we're not ready for, probably. But Catherine didn't let go of his shirt. Harrison, thank you for being patient with me, for not pushing. Catherine, you're letting me be part of your life and your legacy. That's not something to push about, that's something to earn. He kissed her forehead gently. Good night. She watched him walk back toward the western house, and only when he was out of sight did she allow herself a broad smile. Falling in love was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, but with Harrison it felt possible. With Harrison it felt right. The next months passed in a blur of hard work and steady courtship. Catherine and Harrison ran the ranch with increasing coordination, their different strengths complementing each other perfectly. He was better with the business side, tracking expenses and negotiating prices. She had a better eye for stock, culling weak animals and identifying promising breeding pairs. Together, they made the Double T more efficient and profitable than it had been in years. Their personal relationship developed in parallel, a slow dance of increasing intimacy. Harrison courted her properly, riding over for dinners and bringing small gifts, wildflowers or interesting rocks, or once a book of poetry he thought she'd enjoy. Catherine wasn't used to being courted, but she found she liked it, liked the attention and care Harrison put into making her feel special. By October, they were openly affectionate in front of the ranch hands, holding hands or stealing kisses when they thought no one was watching. The men took it in stride, seeming pleased that their employers were happy. It was good for morale, Catherine thought, seeing the bosses getting along so well. One cool evening, as autumn painted the cottonwoods gold, Harrison invited Catherine to ride out to the northern boundary of the combined property. They'd been talking about expanding the herd, and he wanted to show her a section he thought could support more cattle with some water development. They rode in comfortable silence, the setting sun throwing long shadows across the grassland. When they reached the spot Harrison had in mind, he dismounted and helped Catherine down, his hands lingering on her waist. What do you think? He gestured at the rolling terrain, a natural basin that currently held only sparse grass. It has potential. Catherine walked the area, examining the soil and the lay of the land. We'd need to drill a well or run a pipeline from the creek, and fence it separately so we could rotate grazing. That's what I was thinking. Harrison came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. It would be an investment, but it would pay off within a few years. Catherine leaned into his warmth, watching the sun sink lower. They stood like that for a long moment, and then Harrison's voice came quiet near her ear. "Marry me, Catherine." She went very still. "What? Marry me?" He turned her gently to face him, his hands on her shoulders. "I love you. I want to build a life with you, not just a business. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep with you every night. I want to raise children with you on this land we both love. I want everything, Catherine. With you." Her heart was racing so fast she felt dizzy. "Harrison, we've only known each other 6 months. I know. And if you need more time, I'll wait. But I wanted you to know where I stand, where I'm hoping this is going." He cupped her face in his hands. "I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You're my partner in every way that matters. I want to make it official." Catherine searched his face, seeing nothing but honesty and hope. 6 months wasn't very long, but she'd spent more time with Harrison in those 6 months than most courting couples spent together in years. They'd worked side by side in heat and dust, solved problems together, built something together. She knew his character, knew his values, knew his heart. "Yes," she said, and watched joy transform his face. "Yes, I'll marry you." Harrison let out a whoop that startled both their horses and swept Catherine into his arms, spinning her around until she was laughing and dizzy. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, and Catherine kissed him back with all the love and hope and certainty she felt. "I don't have a ring yet," Harrison said when they finally broke apart. "I wanted to ask first, make sure you'd say yes before I presumed. I don't need a fancy ring." Catherine was grinning so hard her face hurt. "I need a partner, and I've already got that. You're getting a ring anyway." Harrison pulled her close again, tucking her head under his chin. "And a proper wedding and whatever else you want. You deserve everything, Catherine." They rode back to the ranch as darkness fell, and Catherine felt like she was floating. Engaged. She was engaged to Harrison Nash, and instead of being terrified, she felt peaceful and sure. This was right. They were right together. Planning a wedding turned out to be more complicated than Catherine had anticipated. They wanted something simple, but Harrison insisted on doing it properly, with announcements and a church ceremony and a reception. Catherine's only living relative was a cousin in St. Louis who couldn't make the journey, but Harrison had family scattered across Texas and New Mexico, and they all seemed determined to attend. They settled on a date in late November, giving people time to travel but getting married before winter weather made the roads impassable. Catherine ordered a dress from Santa Fe, cream-colored silk that made her feel simultaneously beautiful and ridiculous. She was used to work clothes, not fancy gowns. "You look stunning," Harrison told her when she showed him the dress after it arrived. They were sitting in her kitchen, reviewing seating arrangements for the reception. "I'm going to be the luckiest man in New Mexico. Flattery won't get you out of helping with these invitations." But Catherine was smiling. She loved how Harrison looked at her, like she was precious and powerful all at once. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, the sky that particular brilliant blue that only appeared in New Mexico autumn. Catherine dressed with shaking hands, surprised by her own nervousness. This was what she wanted, what they'd both chosen. But it was still a huge step, a public commitment that would change everything. Her oldest ranch hand, a grizzled cowboy named Pete who'd worked for her father, knocked on her door as she was trying to manage the buttons on the back of her dress. "Need some help, Miss Catherine?" She let him in, and Pete's weathered face softened as he fastened the tiny buttons with surprising gentleness. "Your daddy would be proud," he said quietly. "Harrison's a good man. He'll take care of you." "I don't need taking care of," Catherine said automatically. Pete chuckled. "I know that, and so does Harrison. That's why your daddy would approve. He's marrying you as a partner, not a possession. That's the right way. The church in Glenrio was packed with people, ranchers and townspeople and Harrison's sprawling family. Catherine walked down the aisle alone, having refused several offers of male relatives to give her away. She belonged to herself, and she was choosing Harrison freely. That felt important. Harrison waited at the altar looking nervous and handsome in a dark suit she'd never seen him wear before. When she reached him and took his hands, his expression transformed into pure happiness. The ceremony was traditional, the words familiar from dozens of weddings Catherine had attended over the years. But when Harrison repeated his vows, promising to love and cherish and honor her, his voice was thick with emotion. And when Catherine said her own vows, promising the same, she meant every word with her whole heart. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." The preacher smiled at them. "You may kiss your bride." Harrison kissed her sweetly, carefully, mindful of their audience. But Catherine saw the promise in his eyes of deeper kisses to come when they were alone. The reception was held at the Double T, in the big barn that they'd cleaned out and decorated with fall flowers and ribbons. There was music and dancing, food and drink, toasts and laughter. Catherine found herself passed from partner to partner, as various relatives and friends claimed dances, but her eyes kept finding Harrison across the room, and every time their gazes met, she felt a flutter of anticipation. Finally, as the party was winding down and the guests were beginning to drift away, Harrison found her and pulled her onto the dance floor one more time. "Dance with your husband, Mrs. Nash, Mrs. Nash." Catherine tried the name out in her mind and found she liked it, even though she'd keep Torres for the ranch business. "I suppose I could spare one more dance." They swayed together as the fiddler played something slow and sweet, Harrison's arms around her waist and Catherine's head on his shoulder. The barn was warm from all the bodies, and through the open doors she could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Happy," Harrison murmured. "Very." Catherine pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "I love you. I love you too." He kissed her forehead. "Ready to start our life together?" "Ready." They'd prepared the Western ranch house for after the wedding, Harrison's larger home becoming their shared residence. Catherine felt a pang leaving the house where she'd grown up, but it would still be used for ranch operations. Nothing was really being lost, just transformed. The house was quiet and lit with lamplight when they arrived. Someone, probably Pete, had left a fire burning in the hearth and flowers on the table. Harrison carried Catherine over the threshold despite her protests that it was silly, and set her down gently in the middle of the main room. "Alone at last," he said, and there was heat in his voice that made Catherine's stomach flip. "Harrison." She wasn't entirely sure what to say. She knew the basic mechanics of what happened between husbands and wives, but knowing and experiencing were different things. He seemed to sense her nerves. "We don't have to rush. We have all the time in the world. I'm not scared." Catherine stepped closer to him. "Maybe a little nervous, but not scared. Not with you." Harrison cupped her face in his hands, studying her expression in the lamplight. "You're the bravest person I know, Catherine Nash, and the most beautiful." He kissed her then, deep and lingering, and Catherine felt herself melting into it. They'd kissed many times over the past months, but this felt different. This felt like permission to want more, to take more. Harrison's hands moved to the buttons at the back of her dress, the same ones Pete had fastened that morning, and Catherine let him unfasten them slowly, the silk falling away. What followed was tender and awkward and wonderful, two people learning each other in the most intimate way possible. Harrison was patient and careful, putting Catherine's comfort ahead of his own desire, and Catherine was surprised by how natural it felt to be with him like this. There was vulnerability but no shame, uncertainty but no fear. Just love and trust, and the beginning of a physical connection that would grow stronger over time. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, Catherine's head on Harrison's chest and his arm around her shoulders. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "Are you all right?" Harrison's voice was soft, his hand stroking through her hair. "More than all right." Catherine pressed a kiss to his chest. "That was perfect. I love you so much." He tightened his arm around her. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." "You already deserve me. That's why I married you." Catherine yawned, suddenly exhausted from the long day. "We're partners, Harrison, equal partners, in everything." "In everything," he agreed, and Catherine heard the smile in his voice. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Catherine's last thought before unconsciousness claimed her was that she'd never felt so safe, so loved, so completely at home. Married life suited them both. Catherine and Harrison fell into an easy rhythm, working the ranch during the day and sharing their evenings together. They divided responsibilities clearly, with Catherine handling the cattle operations and breeding program, while Harrison managed the business side and expansion plans. But they consulted each other on everything major, making decisions together and respecting each other's expertise. The ranch hands adjusted to calling Catherine Mrs. Nash and took direction from either employer equally. The Double T prospered under their joint management, and by spring, they were able to hire 2 more hands and purchase an additional 100 head of cattle. Catherine discovered she enjoyed the physical side of marriage more than she'd expected. Harrison was an attentive lover, and their nights together were a mix of passion and playfulness that deepened their bond. She felt cherished and desired in a way she'd never experienced before, and she tried to show Harrison the same care and affection he showed her. In April, Catherine realized she'd missed her monthly courses. At first she thought it was just the stress and hard work of running the ranch, but when she missed a second month and started feeling queasy in the mornings, she couldn't deny what was happening. She was pregnant. Catherine sat with that knowledge for a few days, trying to sort through her feelings. She wanted children, had always assumed she'd have them eventually. But she'd imagined having more time, getting the ranch fully established before adding the complications of pregnancy and a baby. Still, it wasn't unwelcome news, just surprising. She told Harrison one evening after dinner when they were sitting together on the porch watching the sunset, "I have something to tell you. Sounds serious." Harrison pulled her closer against his side. "I'm pregnant." He went very still. "What?" "Pregnant, with child, going to have a baby." Catherine looked up at him, trying to read his expression. "Probably due in late October or early November." Harrison's face split into the widest smile she'd ever seen on him. "Catherine, that's wonderful." He pulled her into his lap, kissing her thoroughly. "A baby, we're having a baby." His joy was infectious, and Catherine found herself laughing. "You're happy about this?" "Happy, I'm ecstatic." Harrison placed a hand on her stomach, which was still flat. "Our child, a little piece of both of us." "Catherine, this is the best news you could have given me." Over the following months, Catherine learned that pregnancy was simultaneously empowering and frustrating. Her body was doing something miraculous, growing a new life, but she hated feeling limited and tired. She kept working as long as she could, despite Harrison's increasingly worried hovering. "I'm pregnant, not fragile," she told him in July, when he tried to prevent her from helping move cattle to new pasture. "Women have babies all the time while doing far more difficult work than this." "I know, but you're my wife and I worry." Harrison looked miserable. "I can't help it," Catherine softened. "I'll be careful, I promise. But I need to stay active, Harrison. I'll go crazy if you make me sit around doing nothing for months." They compromised, with Catherine continuing light ranch work, but agreeing to avoid anything strenuous or dangerous. As her belly grew rounder, she found herself simultaneously fascinated and annoyed by the changes in her body. Harrison seemed to find her pregnancy beautiful, constantly touching her stomach and talking about their plans for the baby. They converted a small room off their bedroom into a nursery, painting it yellow and building a cradle from cottonwood wood. Catherine sewed baby clothes while Harrison carved toys, both of them preparing for the new life that would join them soon. On a cold November evening, exactly 1 year after their wedding, Catherine went into labor. Harrison rode for the midwife in town while Pete stayed with Catherine, talking calmly to her while she breathed through contractions. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Sullivan, arrived within an hour and took charge efficiently. Harrison was banished to the main room but refused to go far, pacing and wearing a path in the floorboards. Pete tried to distract him with conversation and whiskey, but nothing could settle his nerves. Labor lasted through the night and into the early morning. Catherine was tougher than most women Mrs. Sullivan had attended, biting through the pain without much complaint, but it was still hard and exhausting work. Just before dawn, with one final tremendous effort, Catherine delivered a healthy baby boy. The baby's first cry brought Harrison running, despite Mrs. Sullivan's protests about men in the birthing room. He burst through the door to find Catherine propped up against pillows, exhausted and glowing, holding a tiny squirming bundle wrapped in blankets. "A son," Catherine said, her voice hoarse. "We have a son, Harrison." Harrison crossed to the bed and carefully sat down, staring at the red-faced infant with wonder. "He's perfect. You're perfect." He kissed Catherine's forehead reverently. "Thank you." They named him Henry Thomas Nash, after Harrison's father and Catherine's father. Little Henry was a good baby, healthy and strong-lunged, and Harrison was immediately besotted. Catherine watched her husband hold their son with such tenderness and awe, and felt her love for him deepen even further. This was family. This was everything. The first months with a newborn were exhausting but joyful. Catherine managed to keep one hand in ranch operations while caring for Henry, though she had to delegate more than she was comfortable with at first. Harrison proved to be a devoted father, changing diapers and walking the floor with a crying baby in the middle of the night without complaint. "You're good at this," Catherine told him one night, watching him soothe Henry with gentle rocking. "I love him." Harrison's voice was quiet, full of emotion. "I love both of you more than I knew it was possible to love. You're my whole world, Catherine." As Henry grew from infant to toddler, the Double T Ranch continued to thrive. Catherine and Harrison had established themselves as respected ranchers, known for quality stock and fair dealing. They weathered droughts and market fluctuations, always supporting each other through the difficult times. When Henry was 2 years old, Catherine realized she was pregnant again. This time the news felt more expected, more planned. Harrison was just as excited as he'd been the first time, and Henry seemed fascinated by the idea of a baby sibling, though at 2 he didn't really understand what that meant. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara Rose, was born on a beautiful spring morning in 1886. She had Catherine's dark eyes and Harrison's easy smile, and Henry was immediately protective of his baby sister. Watching her son gently pat the baby's head while Harrison held her, Catherine felt a sense of complete contentment. This was what happiness looked like. Years passed in a blur of ranch work and child rearing, busy days and loving nights. They added to the ranch house, building extra rooms for their growing family. Henry grew into a sturdy boy who loved horses and wanted to be a cowboy like his father. Clara was more thoughtful, often found following her mother around and asking endless questions about the cattle and the land. In 1889, Catherine gave birth to their third child, another boy they named William James. With 3 children and a thriving ranch, their lives were full and chaotic and wonderful. Catherine couldn't imagine anything else, couldn't remember the woman she'd been before Harrison rode up to her porch that hot July day years ago. "You ever regret it?" Harrison asked her one evening. They were sitting on the porch of the ranch house they'd built together, watching their 3 children play in the yard while the sun set over the New Mexico landscape they both loved. "Giving up your independence to share your life with me." Catherine turned to look at her husband, seeing the gray that was starting to thread through his dark hair, the lines around his eyes that came from years of sun and laughter. He was 40 now, she was 31, and they'd built something remarkable together. "I didn't give up my independence," she said firmly. "I chose to share it with someone I love and trust. That's different. And no, I don't regret it for a second, do you?" "Never." Harrison pulled her close, kissing her temple. "You're still the best thing that ever happened to me, Harrison Nash. You and our children and this life we've made. Remember when we were just neighbors with a fence line dispute?" Catherine smiled at the memory. "You rode up to my porch looking like you expected a fight. And you stood there covered in flour looking like you'd give me one." Harrison chuckled. "I think I started falling for you that first day. You were so fierce and capable and beautiful. I knew right then that you were going to change my life. You changed mine too." Catherine rested her head on his shoulder, made it better in every way. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children and their land as darkness gathered. The property line that had once divided them was long forgotten, the fence maintaining it merely practical rather than contentious. The two halves of the old Double T Ranch had become one again, unified not just on paper but in practice, in family, in love. Henry came running up to the porch, his 7-year-old face flushed with excitement. "Papa, can we go check the north pasture tomorrow? Pete said there might be new calves." "We'll go first thing in the morning," Harrison promised. "You can help me count them." Clara wandered over more slowly, carrying 3-year-old William on her hip even though he was almost too heavy for her. "Mama, William's getting tired." Catherine stood and took her youngest son, feeling his warm weight settle against her. "Time for bed anyway. Say good night to your papa." The bedtime routine was familiar and comforting, tucking each child in with stories and kisses. Harrison helped, moving from room to room with Catherine, and by the time they returned to their own bedroom all 3 children were sleeping. 3 children, Harrison marveled, pulling Catherine into his arms. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it. We've built something amazing, Catherine." "We have." Catherine wrapped her arms around his waist. "The ranch, the family, all of it. I'm proud of what we've made together. You know what the best part is?" Harrison tilted her chin up so he could see her face. "We're just getting started. We've got years ahead of us still. Years to watch our children grow, to build the ranch even bigger, to love each other." Catherine kissed him, pouring years of love and gratitude into it. Harrison was right. They had so much ahead of them still, so many experiences yet to share. The partnership that had started with a property dispute had grown into something neither of them could have imagined, something strong and true and lasting. The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the milestones of their children. Henry grew into a young man who shared his father's easy way with horses and his mother's sharp eye for cattle. At 16, he was already invaluable help on the ranch, and both Catherine and Harrison knew he'd take over the Double T someday, continuing the legacy they'd built. Clara surprised them by showing interest in the business side of ranching, poring over account books and asking sharp questions about profit margins and market trends. At 14, she already had Harrison's head for numbers and strategy. Catherine made sure her daughter learned both the practical ranch work and the business management, determined that Clara would have every opportunity she'd had. William, now 10, was still young enough to be mostly interested in play, but he showed signs of inheriting his mother's quiet determination and his father's charm. He could talk almost anyone into anything, a skill that would serve him well in life. In 1896, Catherine and Harrison celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary with a party that drew ranchers from 3 counties. The Double T had become one of the most successful operations in the region, and Catherine and Harrison were respected not just for their business acumen, but for their partnership. Everyone knew the story of how they'd merged 2 halves of a divided ranch and built something greater than the sum of its parts. 15 years, Catherine said that night, dancing with Harrison as musicians played and their friends celebrated around them. It doesn't seem that long. Best 15 years of my life. Harrison spun her expertly, and Catherine laughed. He'd become a much better dancer over the years. Here's to 15 more and 15 after that, and as many as we're given. I'll take as many as I can get with you. Catherine felt the familiar warmth of love and gratitude that Harrison always inspired in her. You're still my best partner in everything. The new century approached, bringing changes to the West. The open range was disappearing, replaced by fenced ranches and more settled communities. Railroads made shipping cattle easier, but also brought more competition. Catherine and Harrison adapted as they always had, working together to keep the Double T prosperous even as the world around them transformed. Their children grew toward adulthood, each finding their own paths while staying connected to the ranch that was their heritage. Henry courted and eventually married the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a smart young woman named Elizabeth who fit into the family naturally. They built a house on the eastern portion of the property, the same section that had once belonged solely to Catherine, and began their own life while working the ranch alongside Henry's parents. Clara shocked local society by insisting on attending college in Santa Fe to study business, but Catherine and Harrison supported her fully. Their daughter returned with even more knowledge and fresh ideas that helped modernize the ranch operations. She eventually married a lawyer from town, a quiet man who respected her intelligence and ambition. William chose a different path entirely, joining the cavalry and serving his country. Catherine worried about him constantly, but Harrison reminded her that their youngest son had the same independent spirit she'd always shown. When William's service ended, he returned to the Double T and threw himself into ranch work with renewed appreciation for the land and the life he'd grown up with. On a warm evening in 1908, Catherine and Harrison sat on their porch watching the sunset, as they'd done thousands of times before. They were older now, both in their 50s, moving a bit slower but still active in ranch management. Henry handled most of the day-to-day operations now, but Catherine and Harrison remained involved, their experience and wisdom guiding the younger generation. "You remember the day we met?" Catherine asked, her hand in Harrison's. "When my cattle broke through that rotted fence, like it was yesterday," Harrison smiled. "I rode up expecting to deal with an angry man and found you instead, changed everything." "You proposed settling the property line," Catherine remembered. "Though it took a while before you proposed settling everything else," Harrison laughed. "Best proposal I ever made, and the best decision you ever made was saying yes." "I don't know about that." Catherine squeezed his hand. "I think my best decision was trusting you enough to be partners in the first place. The marriage just naturally followed." 26 years. Harrison's voice was full of wonder. 26 years married, and I love you more now than I did on our wedding day. Same. Catherine leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the sky turn orange and pink and purple. We've had a good life, Harrison, a really good life. We're not done yet. Harrison kissed the top of her head. We've got grandchildren to meet, more years to spend together, more sunsets to watch from this porch. He was right, of course. Henry and Elizabeth had recently announced they were expecting their first child, which would make Catherine and Harrison grandparents. The thought filled Catherine with joy and a touch of disbelief. How had she become old enough to be a grandmother? But then she looked at Harrison, saw the gray in his hair and the lines on his beloved face, and realized they'd earned every year, every line, every gray hair. The next few years brought 5 grandchildren in total, as all 3 of their children had families of their own. The double T rang with the laughter of the next generation. Children who would grow up on this land just as their parents had, learning the same lessons about hard work and integrity and love. Catherine took joy in teaching her granddaughters that women could be strong and capable and run ranches just as well as men. She made sure the grandsons learned that respecting women and treating them as equals was the only acceptable way. The legacy she and Harrison were leaving wasn't just land and cattle, but values and examples of how to build a life of meaning. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1913, Catherine and Harrison renewed their vows in the same church where they'd married. All 3 of their children attended with their families, and the church was packed with friends and employees and neighbors whose lives they'd touched over 3 decades. I, Catherine Torres Nash, reaffirm my commitment to you, Harrison, Catherine said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. You have been my partner, my best friend, my love for 30 years. You've made my life richer and fuller than I ever imagined possible. I promise to love you for whatever years we have remaining, through whatever comes, until death parts us. Harrison's voice was equally emotional when he spoke his own reaffirmation. Catherine, you are the best part of my life and always have been. Marrying you was the smartest thing I ever did. Building this life with you, raising our children, growing old together, it's all been an honor and a joy. I love you more with each passing year, and I'll love you until my last breath and beyond. They kissed, and the church erupted in applause and cheers. Their grandchildren laughed and clapped, not fully understanding the depth of emotion in the room, but happy because their grandparents were happy. The party afterward lasted long into the night, with music and dancing and storytelling. Old friends recounted memories of Catherine and Harrison's early days, the property dispute that had brought them together, the partnership that had become legendary in local ranching circles. Younger people listened and learned, seeing the proof that love and respect and equality could build something lasting. As the party wound down and guests began departing, Catherine and Harrison found themselves alone on the porch once more, their favorite spot for important moments. The November air was cool, and Harrison wrapped a blanket around both their shoulders as they sat close together. 30 years, Catherine marveled. Sometimes it feels like no time at all, and sometimes it feels like I can barely remember life before you. I can't remember and don't want to. Harrison pulled her closer. You've been the center of my world for so long, Catherine. Everything good in my life came from saying yes when you invited me to dinner that first time, from proposing partnership, and then marriage, from building this life with you. We did build it together, Catherine agreed. Equal partners from the start. That's why it worked, Harrison, because neither of us tried to dominate or control. We respected each other and loved each other and worked as a team. Best team in New Mexico. Harrison kissed her temple. You know what I'm most proud of? It's not the size of the ranch or how much we've accomplished. It's that our children saw us model a good marriage, a real partnership. They're all building the same kind of relationships with their own spouses. That's a legacy worth more than any amount of land or money. Catherine turned to kiss him properly, still feeling that flutter of love and desire even after 30 years. I love you, Harrison Nash, today, tomorrow, and always. Always, he echoed, and they sat together watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, content in the knowledge that they'd built something rare and precious and lasting. The years that followed were gentler, slower. Catherine and Harrison gradually handed over more responsibility to Henry while remaining active advisors and beloved grandparents. They took pleasure in simpler things now, quiet mornings over coffee, afternoon rides across familiar land, evenings with family. The pace of life slowed, but the depth of their connection only grew stronger. In 1920, as they approached their 40th anniversary, Harrison developed a persistent cough that worried Catherine. The doctor in town prescribed rest and medicine, and for a while Harrison seemed to improve. But Catherine could see him tiring more easily, moving with less energy. She said nothing, not wanting to acknowledge what she feared, but Harrison knew her too well to be fooled. "Catherine," he said one evening as they prepared for bed, "we need to talk about what happens when I'm gone." "You're not going anywhere." Catherine's voice was sharper than intended, fear making her defensive. "Not today, maybe not for years yet, but eventually." Harrison took her hand gently. "We're both 62 years old, love. We've been blessed with good health and long lives, but we're not immortal. I need to know you'll be all right." Catherine sat on the edge of their bed, fighting tears. "I can't imagine my life without you in it. You won't have to imagine it alone. You'll have our children and grandchildren. You'll have this ranch we built together. You'll have all the memories and love we've shared." Harrison sat beside her and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I'm not planning on leaving you anytime soon, but when the time comes, I need you to promise me you'll keep living, keep finding joy. Don't just exist, Catherine. Keep being the strong, vibrant woman I fell in love with." That's a hard promise to make, but Catherine leaned into his embrace, drawing strength from his familiar warmth. "I know, but it's important to me." Harrison kissed her hair. "You gave me the best life any man could ask for. When my time comes, I'll go grateful and happy. But you need to keep going, keep the ranch thriving, keep being a guiding force for our family. Promise me." "I promise." The words hurt to say, but Catherine meant them. She would honor Harrison's wishes, no matter how much it cost her. Harrison's health stabilized over the next few years, the scare proving to be just that. They celebrated their 40th anniversary surrounded by family, a smaller affair than the 30th, but no less meaningful. 40 years of marriage, more than half a century of knowing each other. Catherine looked at Harrison across the dinner table, at his completely gray hair and the deep lines on his face, and saw the man who'd ridden up to her porch all those years ago, who'd proposed partnership and won her heart. In the fall of 1924, as the leaves turned gold on the cottonwoods and the air took on that crisp quality that marked the changing season, Harrison passed away peacefully in his sleep. Catherine woke to find him beside her, still and quiet, his expression peaceful. He looked like he'd simply drifted off and decided not to come back. The grief was overwhelming, a physical weight that made breathing difficult. Catherine had known this day would come eventually, but knowing didn't make it easier. She'd lost her partner, her best friend, the love of her life. The man who'd shared her bed and her dreams and her daily life for 42 years was gone. The funeral drew people from across the state, ranchers and business people and friends whose lives Harrison had touched. Catherine stood dry-eyed through the service, saving her tears for private moments. She spoke at the funeral, her voice steady despite her shattered heart. Harrison Nash was my husband, my business partner, and my dearest friend. He was a man of integrity and kindness, someone who treated everyone with respect regardless of their station in life. He believed in hard work and fair dealing, in keeping his word and standing by his commitments. But most of all, he believed in partnership, in the idea that two people working together could accomplish more than either could alone. That was how we built our ranch and our marriage, and that was the example we tried to set for our children. Harrison lived a full life and a good one. He loved deeply and was deeply loved in return. That's the best any of us can hope for. After the funeral, after the visitors left and the food stopped appearing, and life was supposed to return to normal, Catherine found herself adrift. The ranch continued operating under Henry's capable management, but Catherine couldn't find her footing. Everything reminded her of Harrison. The porch where they'd watched countless sunsets, the bedroom they'd shared, the land they'd worked together. Even the cattle bore the marks of breeding programs they'd developed as a team. Her children worried about her. Clara came to stay for a few weeks, and William visited regularly, but Catherine couldn't seem to shake the fog of grief. She went through the motions of living but felt hollow inside, like a piece of her had been buried with Harrison. It was her oldest grandchild, Henry's son Thomas, who finally broke through. The boy was 15 now, thoughtful and serious, and he found Catherine sitting alone in the barn one afternoon just staring at nothing. "Grandma," Thomas sat down beside her. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Did Grandpa really propose to settle a property line dispute when he first met you?" Despite everything, Catherine felt a smile tug at her lips. "That's the story, yes." "Why?" "Because I was thinking about it, and that's kind of romantic, isn't it?" He saw a problem, and instead of fighting about it, he proposed working together. And then you built this whole amazing thing from that one decision. Thomas looked at her seriously. "I think Grandpa would want you to keep building, not stop because he's not here anymore." Catherine felt tears sting her eyes, but they weren't entirely sad tears. "You're very wise for 15, Thomas. I just know that Grandpa loved this ranch and this family more than anything, and he loved you most of all. I don't think he'd want you to be sad forever." "No," Catherine agreed quietly. "He wouldn't. He made me promise to keep living, to keep finding joy. I'm just not sure how to do that without him." "Maybe you start small," Thomas suggested. "Do one thing Grandpa loved, then do another. Eventually, maybe it gets easier." Out of the mouths of children, Catherine thought. Or in this case, wise young men. She hugged her grandson, feeling grateful for his insight and his care. "Thank you, Thomas. I think I needed to hear that." True to her promise to Harrison, Catherine began the slow process of rebuilding her life. She threw herself back into ranch work, consulting with Henry on major decisions, and even taking on some of the tasks she delegated in recent years. The physical labor was grounding, and being out on the land she and Harrison had loved together felt like being close to him. She spent time with her grandchildren, sharing stories about Harrison and teaching them the lessons he would have taught. She made sure they understood that their grandfather had been a man who believed in partnership and equality, who'd never let gender or convention stop him from treating people fairly. The first year was the hardest, full of firsts without Harrison. First Christmas, first spring roundup, first anniversary of their meeting. But Catherine survived each milestone, and slowly the grief began to soften from sharp agony to dull ache to bittersweet memory. 5 years after Harrison's death, Catherine stood on the porch of the ranch house on a cool November evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar colors. She was 67 years old now, her hair gone mostly silver and her body moving with the careful deliberateness of age. But she was still here, still living, still finding moments of joy. She thought about Harrison often, talked to him sometimes when she was alone. She'd kept her promise to him, had kept living and finding purpose. The ranch was thriving under Henry's management. Their children were happy and successful, and their grandchildren were growing into fine young people. The legacy she and Harrison had built together continued, strong and lasting. "We did good, didn't we?" Catherine spoke aloud to the empty air, to the ghost of her husband that she carried always in her heart. "We took a property dispute and turned it into something beautiful. We built a ranch and a family and a love that lasted through everything. I miss you every day, but I'm grateful for every moment we had. Thank you for choosing me, for proposing that partnership all those years ago. It was the best decision either of us ever made." The wind picked up slightly, rustling through the cottonwood trees, and Catherine chose to believe it was Harrison's answer. She smiled and turned to go inside, to the home they'd made together, in the life they'd built from a boundary dispute and a cowboy's proposal to work together. Catherine Torres Nash lived to be 83 years old, active and sharp until the very end. When she passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1940, surrounded by 3 generations of family, the funeral rivaled Harrison's for attendance and emotion. She was laid to rest next to her husband in the small cemetery outside Glenrio, their shared headstone reading simply, "Catherine Torres Nash and Harrison Nash, partners in life and love. They built something that lasts." The Double T Ranch continued under Henry's management and eventually passed to his children, then to theirs. The story of how it came to be, of the property dispute and the cowboy's proposal and the partnership that became a legendary love story, was told and retold to each new generation. It became part of family lore, a reminder that the best foundations were built on respect and equality and genuine partnership. The fence line that had once divided the ranch was long gone, absorbed into the unified whole that Catherine and Harrison had created. But the cottonwood tree where Harrison had first proposed marriage still stood, and family members would sometimes sit beneath it to mark important moments. Proposals happened there, anniversaries were celebrated there, and sometimes people would just sit and think about the 2 people who'd shown them that love and partnership could overcome any obstacle. In the end, Catherine and Harrison's true legacy wasn't the land or the cattle, or even the successful ranch they'd built. It was the example they'd set, the proof that 2 people who respected and loved each other could accomplish anything together. They'd shown their children and grandchildren, and all who knew them, that real partnership meant equality, that love meant supporting each other's dreams, and that the best way to settle any dispute was to work together rather than fight. From a broken fence and a property dispute, they'd built a love story for the ages. And that love, that partnership, continued to inspire long after both of them were gone, proof that the best things in life are built together, with trust and respect and genuine affection as the foundation.